Okay, so we were in the middle of this very lengthy commentary yesterday um, regarding when you hire a cab and you cancel the cab. So we said that there are a number of factors here. If the cab driver has other jobs that he can do, and so he's not losing money, you're not required to pay him anything at all. If, however, he set aside a day and therefore lost other fares, then it would depend if you were an onus or not. If you're an onus and are simply not able to go and you notified him as soon as you discovered that, so then you're not chayiv. But if you could have notified him earlier, or you just decide you don't want to go, not that you can't go, so then you do have to pay him like a poel batel for his losses. He says, but he points out, he says, "V'hinei kishetzarach lases lo kipol batel." Am I sharing my screen? Yeah, I think so. Matzinu betaz b'shar pirushim dekasvu deshiuru hu chatzi haschirus. He says we've pointed out before. Yes, I'm pretty sure I am. That when you pay someone like a poel batel, you have to pay them half of what the normal fare or normal rate would have been. However, he says, but in a situation like this, ulam b'nidon zeh vaday di'ef shalach shivkein. But there's no way that you can make that calculus over here. Shaharei demei hanasiya shel harechev kolel b'tocho gam et hotzaot shel hadelek ushar dvarim hakshurim l'nasiya. He says because over here, if you hired a guy to take you from Yerushalayim to Tzfat, and you end up canceling. So he's lost a full day of driving. But to say that I should pay you half of what you normally would have gotten, which was maybe, let's say, 700 shekels, whatever it was, but that's also not reasonable to give you now 350 shekels because 700 shekels is not just for your labor, it's for your gas, and it's for your other expenses over the course of the trip. Maybe you need to buy food and things like that. V'lachein, and therefore, yesh lechashev rak kechatzi mehaschar shel etzem ha'avodah. So you have to deduct from that 700 shekels the expenses. So maybe really in labor, it's only 500 shekels. And then you would take half of that, which would be 250. So that would be the way of calculating what you really owe the guy. Uvamakom shebal harechev hifsid nisiya. So he says, in a situation where you do have to pay him because he lost a day of work and he could have taken other passengers and you were not in oines, so you have to pay him like a poel batel, think about the following scenario. Mahadin b'makom shehamazmin eno rotze laha'amino. The toin shekol zman shelo yochiach lo shahaya lo hazmana acheres ve'ivsu biglalo eno ma'amino. What would be the halacha if the passenger, the person who had hired the driver, says, "What are you talking about? If I hadn't hired you, you would have had so many other jobs. I think you're just bluffing. I think that you're just a guy who's out of work, and I had rachmanis on you, and I was going to hire you to drive me. But if I hadn't hired you, who else would have hired you? You don't work for, you're not a regular cabbie." And so therefore, just because you printed up cards that you call yourself a driver doesn't mean you would necessarily have had a full day of work just because I ended up canceling. So what if the passenger wants to be difficult and says, "I don't believe you"? So So he says, on the one hand, it would seem that the passenger does have a right to make such a claim. As we know many times, that there's a halacha that if you wish to extract from your friend, then you have to bring proof. So if I'm making a claim as the passenger that I shouldn't have to pay you because I don't believe your claim that you would have had in other opportunities, prove to me that you would have. He says, so why don't we say the same thing over here, that the driver who was canceled should have to bring proof? So he says, Ulam ra'isi bichidushe haritva. He says, however, I've noticed that the Ritva and the Shita Mekubetzes in Bava Metzia write, Al Hada Amrinan Sham Begemara Vad Kama Socher Alein Ad Arboim Vachamishim Zuz Vamed Dvarim Amurim Bizman She'en Sham Poalim Liskor Avol Yesham Poalim Liskor Va'omar Tzeu Schor Me'elu Ein Lo Alehem Ela Tarumas. So he says that I think the case of the Gemara over there is where a worker quits, and there's recriminations against the employee who quits because now the balabayas has to hire other workers at a much higher rate. And if there are other employees that he can hire, so then all he has is a grievance. He doesn't have any legal recourse against the employee who quit. Because of a ritva zal midanakat hailishna mashma shaleim laharos ulavarir the ika polim liskor the ika tainu kfir bazeh ben balabayis lapol and alapol al biraya ad kan lashona. He says in that situation, it seems that the workers have to bring proof if they wish to avoid having to pay their employer for the loss that he claims he's incurring, which seems to be quite strange because the employer is trying to extract from the employees over there. Okay, so I'm just skipping a little bit. So he says, "Uvenidon hazmanas rechev yesh lihistapek mahadin heicha." Okay, so first of all, he basically says, "I'm not really sure about that, whether the driver is obligated to bring proof or not that he had other opportunities, because it could be that once I, as a passenger, hire a cab driver, I've already indebted myself to him. It's almost like I've made a commitment to pay him a certain amount of money, in which case he has a lien on my property." That's the argument, the counter argument as to why perhaps the cab driver would not have to bring proof. Now, regarding this case, Yeshli Histapek Mahadin Hecha Shadam Hizbin Makom Lenasia Eitzel Bala Rechev, Chagon minibus or autobus, Shahuragel in Sola Makom Mesuyam. So he says, what would be a guy drives a minibus, which is very common in Israel, like a sherut kind of vehicle, and a guy reserves a spot. There's let's say 8 spots on the minibus going from Yerushalayim to Tzfat, and I reserve one of the spots. And the guy ends up not going, cancels, and the driver says, well, then pay that spot, pay for that spot, because I filled up my minibus and I had to turn away others. The passenger, the person who reserved the spot says, no, wait a minute, I see additional empty spots. It's not like you had a full bus. So you're making money, you're making a sufficient income from the passengers you do have. Why should I have to pay you?
Doesn't go. You're not playing with a full bus.
You would have gone even if I hadn't reserved the spot, because you have sufficient number of passengers. I didn't benefit from you at all, so why should I have to pay you? So imkain ein lecha negdi shum tvia. The harelo garamti lecha shum hefset. So what claim do you have against me? I didn't cause you any loss. So what would I say about that? He says, what?
I can think of a scenario.
Yeah.
If for example, you had 2 empty seats, and this guy let you down, and it was a family of 3, you had to turn them away because you didn't have 3 empty seats, you only had 2 empty seats.
Okay, so in a case where he can demonstrate that he had to turn away people, that I think is a more fair argument. But the way that he's created this scenario is that you've got a bus, let's say, of 30 spots, and you're only taking 20. So my cancellation, I would have been the 21st passenger. So, okay, so right, yeah, okay. So he says the Rama writes in Siman Shin Lamed Hesef Aleph Shekaslav Demakom Shu Pseida de Balabayas Tzarach Litain Lamalamid Tzcharo Mishalim. He says, Afilu Yeshlo Talmidim Acherim Shalomedi Mahem the Dibor Le'echa the Dibor Lemeya Adkan Devarav. He says, when does the Balabayas have to pay? He says, when, let's say, he hires a teacher and then he cancels on the teacher for his a tutor for his child. And let's say you reserve a spot in a classroom. I think that's the case over here. He says there, the Rama says you still have to pay if you cancel. He says because even though the teacher may have other students that he's teaching, Dibur Echad, Dibur Le'echad, Dibur Lemeya, it makes no difference whether you have 1 or 100 students, he's going to be giving the same shir. Now, what is the Rama talking about? The Kavanas Devar of the Im Talmud Lo Lamad Eitzel Rav Shalom Achmas Ones, Al Piadin Habibseda Didei Velo Shel Malamed. He says, let's say I want to put my child in a class of a particular teacher. And then I cancel, not because of an onus, because we said before, when it's an onus, you're not liable. But in that situation, the guy still has plenty of students that he can teach. He's getting paid to pay the students. So the Rama writes, the parent who canceled has to pay the full wage of whatever that course was, even though the person is teaching other students. The dibor le'echa, dibor lemeya, because even though it's true that I have other students, but qualitatively my class would have been the same with your child, and you promised me that you would take a spot. The halacha is, says the Rama, that the parent who pulled out his child has to pay the full wage. In kain lechora dehu adin benidon dindan nomar kain. The av shabal ha'ato hisiya cherem gam kain. Mikol makom hol v'hu hizmin etzlo nesiya tzarich l'shalom lo denesi le'echad nesi l'meya. He says, based on that, it would seem that when you cancel your spot, you still have to pay the driver because it's no different. He's driving to Tzfat anyway for the other passengers, but nonetheless, the halacha still states that if the parent canceled their child's spot and the guy's teaching anyway, you still have to pay him. But Ibra Lamaisa Nira Shahu Patur. However, on the other hand, says Rosh Stern, it seems to me that no. As long as the guy has extra spots and I didn't preclude other people from taking a ride with him, then I'm going to be patur. Why? Dahama'ayin b'makor hadvarim b'shur harashba yira dedin zemayri hecha shekama talmidim sachru lehem rav lelamdam v'yitnu lo kach v'kach avur shana. He says, because the case of the teacher, if you look carefully at the source, is a situation where there was a consortium of parents who got together and decided that they would hire a teacher to teach their children for the year. And they basically said to the teacher, we're guaranteeing you 10 students, and if you want to add additional students, you have the right to do so. That's as an example. And they also, the 10 parents agreed that if anyone backs out, they agree that they will pay their portion of the teacher's salary. And in that situation where each parent of the 10 agreed in advance that they would pay their share, the Rashba explains that if one of them backs out, he still has to pay the full amount. And he explains, Shaharesh yesh lecha milvad schirute eser litrot lo amar klum shelo be'eser litrot bilvad niskar zel l'shana ela laotan asara talmidim bilvad shekibel alamdam be'eser litrot l'shana. He says, because the teacher only agreed to the job because he had 10 parents paying. That was the reason why he did it. V'im yimtza talmidim yoser yosif alehem. V'nimtzeu elu hamosifim she'ein mashlimim schar harishonim. And if he finds additional students, he'll add the additional students, right? And that will be additional additional salary. Okay, ela tosefes chirasu. Ulefizen nira deimispar ha'anashim sochrim b'miyuchad rechav l'nesia mesuyemet. So therefore, it would turn out that if there's a consortium of people who hire a private driver, umatnim shekol echad yitin lo kach v'kach, and everyone agrees that we'll kick in, and the driver basically says, as long as I have 10 people who commit to this job, I will take it, even though my minibus holds, let's say, 20 people. Okay? And the fact is, if he finds additional passengers who want to go to Tzfat, he'll take them as well. But he's only agreed to put together the trip because of the initial 10 people who agreed that they would each pay. But so in that situation, one of the original 10 would have to pay if he ends up canceling. Even if he adds additional people and ends up not losing money, the anticipation is that he only put together the trip in the first place because of the first 10 people who gave their guarantee. And it was always clear that if he wanted to get additional passengers, each one paying additional fares, that would be his responsibility. But he would never have committed to the trip had these 10 people not made their commitment. As I just said. And therefore, even if the driver was able to find an additional 5 people to go up to Tzfat, but your cancellation still causes me loss, because what I was doing is I was saying, what is the minimum that I would need to commit to drive to Tzfat? I would need, let's say, 10 people at 100 shekels a head to make the commitment to this drive, so I would know I would at least get 1,000 shekels. But I also was counting on the fact that I'm going to try to drum up more business. So I'm counting on 1,000 shekels plus whatever other business that I can get. It's the same thing. It's like if 10 parents create a consortium where they're going to hire, let's say we live out in a community where there's no school. So we'll hire a teacher, and we each 10, one of these 10 families will make a commitment of, $5,000 a year and to pay this guy. And we tell the teacher, by the way, there are a few other families. We haven't been able to reach them yet in order to get their commitment, but here are their numbers. And if you'd like to solicit them, you're more than welcome to do so. That doesn't give the right, just because the teacher was industrious and was able to get those 2 other families to commit to $5,000 each, that one of the original 10 has a right to back out now. Doesn't give him the right. And even though they want to argue, well, you were willing to take the job for $50,000 a year, my backing out does not deprive you of that because you got an extra 2 families. Doesn't work that way. He only agreed to take the job because of these initial 10 people, and therefore they are on the hook financially. It's a very interesting analysis, is that once you make a commitment and I've accepted your offer, you have to follow through on the offer, even if I don't lose money as a result of your backing out because I found other passengers. Why? Because the whole terms of the deal was it's 50,000 minimum plus whatever else you can find. So it really wasn't 50,000 guarantee. It was 50,000 plus whatever you can find. So the whatever part that I can find you can't say, well, you're covered, right? Do you understand? Okay.
Compare the two cases. With the hiring a teacher, I recall the case said that they committed that they back out, they'll pay. The passenger never said if I back out, I'll pay.
Yeah, but it could be that that's implicit. That's implicit.
Okay, fair enough.
Right? In other words, the driver, it's understood, the driver's not going to Tzfat unless he gets 10 passengers. Right? That's how a Sheirut works.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, so, the other issue I have is how do we know, or is that just the basis of this case, that the passenger backed out was not one of the additional people as opposed to one of the base people?
It has to be demonstrated to him that was the case. In other words, it has to be demonstrated that
the driver still has to bring proof.
The driver would have to prove that. The driver would have to say, I have a log of every person who made a reservation. I have an internet log of everyone who logged in.
And you were the 10th.
That's right. That's right. The Masha, yeah.
To this sort of thing is where, especially today, is with airlines and booking your seats and booking your. Now that flight is going to take off. Whether there's
not necessarily.
You're right. But there is always the key here is there's a stipulation. So you know usually in advance what's going to happen if you back out. The penalty.
Well, right. Actually, airlines have become much more, since COVID, they've become much more relaxed on penalties. They'll probably reimpose the penalties eventually, if those who haven't yet. But you're right, there are penalties. And as a matter of fact, you can get a more, they call it a flexible fare, where if you pay more money, you have the rights of cancellation, right?
Will the airline cancel a flight if they don't get sufficient passengers?
Yes, they will. In today's world, it happens all the time. And the airlines are ruthless about this. It's all about their bottom line.
They say that? Are they allowed to say that?
No.
They say we have problems.
Yeah, they'll say due to technical difficulties, or or they'll change the times of the flight, or due to customs issues. Right.
So how often are they now obliged to the passenger, really, sort of, for giving them a little credit or something like that because of that? Because it's an opposite sort of situation.
So, sometimes I don't know if they're halachically obligated because you're sort of at the mercy of the airline. They don't make any stipulations that they guarantee to take off on time. I mean, if they did, can you imagine how much money the airlines would lose? After all, many situations are out of their control. Many times they schedule a flight, and one of the biggest issues today is pilot shortage. Have I mentioned that before? I was listening a news story that the U.S. alone is short 14,000 pilots, and so they're scrambling. It sort of makes you a little fearful as to who's flying our planes. If they're short 14,000 pilots and people need to get into the air, who are they hiring? No. Okay, anyway.
The driver of the cab play this kind of game, you can say, okay, the minimum is 10, and I expect to get another 5. I didn't get those other 5, so I'm just going to cancel the trip.
Well, no. So that halachically he wouldn't be allowed to do. Because if he already committed himself to take these 10, how can he back out?
The airline commits the people who bought the tickets that they can fly.
I think if you read the fine print, it says subject to cancellation at any time. I'm sure it says something like that in the fine print, because otherwise people would be suing the airlines right and left. Right? I guess, yeah. You're liable for the full tuition. Yeah. It's the same thing in yeshiva. And that's a situation where you are precluding, quite often, you are precluding someone else from, yeah. The mashalokach od anashim hareza hayarashai the hisnu al zev zev betur tosefes al schara. So he says it's the same thing over here. Guy has extra passengers in addition to the initial 10. He could say that was gravy. Zehu dumi demashakasav harashma. Masha'en ke bebal otabus osan asiyam yisiyam b'li hazmana shel anashim. But let's say we're dealing with a scenario where the driver is going to Tzfat anyway, without, in other words, he has a regular schedule. He goes to Tzfat every day from Jerusalem to Tzfat and back. That's his business. In other words, he's got a regular line that he travels every day. He advertises that it's a daily trip to Tzfat. And the reason why he requires you to make a reservation is not to determine whether he should go or not, but rather to ensure that you'll have a spot, because sometimes he gets overbooked. He says in that situation, that you cannot hold the canceling passenger liable. He says because in that situation, the guy was going to go for sure anyway. Now, the only thing that you could argue is by canceling, you've blocked someone else from paying that fare. The hurak hizman etzlo makom lefichach bishlamim hayelo od hasmanot ad shayimit maleha auto v'hulo kiblam kibin shikvar hayamali desamach halasmanat rishon v'zet tzarich l'shalim mosher yipsido. So he says, in a situation where I needed to make a reservation because there was a line of people, there's a waiting list, and because I canceled, now the guy precluded other people from reserving a seat, then I do have to pay the driver for the full trip. Because by my cancellation, I've made him lose. He's got 15 seats on his van, and he's completely full. He had to turn away other passengers, and he can demonstrate that. And I cancel on him, so then I have to pay the full fare. But in a situation where the guy has plenty of empty seats and he's going anyway to Tzfat on a daily basis, that's what he's advertised, it's his regular routine, then when I cancel, I don't have to pay him. So we've seen there's at least three different scenarios now. Scenario number one that we've seen is where he's only doing it because there's a consortium of people that have hired him and they've reached the critical mass. So then if I back out, because I'm part of that initial critical mass, I have to pay. Scenario number two is if he's going daily anyway, then it depends. Scenario A of that situation is if he has additional seats and he's going anyway, no matter how many passengers he has, then I don't have to pay him. But if he has a completely full bus and I had to turn away other passengers, that's scenario number B. So then I would have to pay him for canceling at the last minute. Okay. Right. Okay. Anyway, we could go on and on in this, but he says, so he says, so let's get to the bottom line. And by the way, he says, if you're an oines, you don't have to pay. As we've learned before, that in the case of ones, the worker loses. So the din al shel arash b'shayach b'kal b'chomer chishmis b'anoshim sochu rechav echad mehem lo bav v'nishar mekomo panoi v'tzarach l'shalom na kol schara v'lo kapol batel dari bal rechav nasam memela. He says in a situation where you have to pay the driver, there you'd have to pay him the full ticket price. In other words, in a situation where you cancel at the last minute, not like a pole bottle, like we said before, but you'd have to pay the full price because he had to end up turning away other people, or because you were part of that critical mass that made him go in the first place. So, ulasikum hadvarim. So what we'll do is we'll save this paragraph. There's going to be like 9 9 statements of outcome from all of the things that we've learned. We'll get to those 9 statements of outcome, 9 piskei halacha. We'll finish that in Mirz Hashem tomorrow. Okay?